Chapter 2. Historical Materialism.
The content of this video consists of the writing of the book's author. The views and opinions expressed belong solely to the author and do not represent those of the owner of this YouTube channel. This video has been created for educational and entertainment purposes only.
Historical materialism may be briefly defined as the application of dialectical materialism on the study of the various forms of society and their development from one form to another. It focuses on that part of nature or material reality where the conscious, social activity and development of man is involved. It delves into the social sciences, rather than into the natural sciences. Historical materialism studies and deals with the fundamental terms of the existence of societies and their social development. It seeks to comprehend the material base and superstructure of any society and the interaction between the two, while a certain form of society exists and carries the potential or is in the actual process of changing or being changed into another form. It links dialectical materialism to political economy and other aspects of social study. Historical materialism uncovers and shows the most essential laws of motion that operate in all and in each of human societies and that govern their development, from their initial growth through maturation to decline and either replacement by a new and higher form of society or retrogression to a lower one. In the entire life of mankind so far, there have arisen several forms of societies in a generally ascending order. Chronologically and progressively, these are: 1. Primitive communal society, 2. Slave society, 3. Feudal society, 4. Capitalist society, and 5. Socialist society. Communist society, a classless society, is projected by Marxists as the form of society that would eventually follow socialist society. We shall follow mainly the historical experience of Western Europe because this is where capitalism and socialism appeared for the first time in a series of social transformations. A. The material base of society. The material base of society is its mode of production or economic system. This consists of the forces and relations of production. The forces of production include the means of production and the people in production. The means of production include the tools of production and the available natural resources which are the object of human labor. The people in production include the actual producers of wealth with a certain level of skills. The relations of production refer to the organization of production or division of labor, the common or private ownership of the means of production and the distribution of the products of labor. In primitive communal society, some simple division of labor existed, but such division did not yet evolve into classes of exploiters and exploited. It was in succeeding forms of society that classes have evolved. The division of labor did not only become sharper, but owing to the evolution to private ownership of the means of production, also an ever sharper division developed between definite classes of exploiters and exploited, and correspondingly in the distribution of the products of labor. In general, the forces of production determine the relations of production and may be considered primary. But at certain times, the relations of production play the primary role either in hastening or restricting the growth of the forces of production. In general, the mode of production as a whole determines the form of society, including the character of non-economic activities in the superstructure. However, such non-economic activities interact with and have a powerful influence on economic activities. We shall discuss this more when we study the superstructure of society. The full significance of the mode of production needs to be recognized. It is oftentimes taken for granted or deliberately obscured. No society whatsoever is possible without it. And such higher things in life as philosophy, politics, science, the arts and letters, lifestyle and the like cannot exist without the necessary material base supporting them. It is through production that man has differentiated himself from other animals and has steadily gained mastery over the spontaneous forces of nature. The prehensility of the hands, the acquisition of language and the development of the brain and thinking are the triumphs of man in tens of thousands of years of crude productive labor. According to progressive anthropologists, man made himself. This statement is made in repudiation of the myth in the Genesis that Yahweh created him whole and placed him at first in Eden without having to sweat and labor. The forces of production in primitive communal society were at an extremely low level. The Paleolithic savage society had for its most potent tools of production crude stones and was dependent on hunting, fishing, and picking fruit. Typically, this kind of society consisted of a nomadic clan. It lasted for several tens of thousands of years before the Neolithic society could emerge. The Neolithic or barbaric society had for its most potent tools of production polished stones and the bow and arrow. Subsequently, it developed husbandry, tillage, basketry, pottery, the use of the cartwheel and the smelting of soft metals, tin and copper. Typically, this kind of society consisted of a tribe. Social development accelerated, but society still lasted a fewer tens of thousands of years. The level of the productive forces was so low that it could not produce a significant surplus for so long. The smallness and limited productive capacity of society limited the surplus it produced. The surplus product was not sufficient for a part of society to be able to form itself into an exploitative class to appropriate and increase that surplus. Stones as tools of production were available to everyone, and it was impossible for any class to gain exclusive ownership or control over them. Although society had not yet divided into exploiting and exploited classes, it certainly was no paradise, as man had to contend with the harshness of nature only with crude tools. There may have been father figures, matriarchs, or leaders in clans or tribes, aside from priests or medicine men. However, these individuals did not comprise an exploitative class. They themselves had to take part in labor. It took some 50,000 or 60,000 years before civilization emerged, with the slave society as its first form. By civilization, we mean the existence of literacy, metallurgy, and class-divided society. The earliest slave societies now known to archaeology, anthropology and history hark back to some 6,000 years ago. These include the Mesopotamian and Elamite societies, dating back to 3500 BC, Egyptian, 3000 BC, and Chinese, 2500 BC. As civilized societies, they had a significant degree of urbanization, and they left written records and artifacts of culture far superior to that of the primitive communal society. At least, they consisted of intertribal nations. Earliest evidence available on the making and use of a hard metal, bronze, an alloy of tin and copper, as tools dates back to 3000 BC. Evidence available on the early use of iron tools dates back to 1050 BC. Bronze and iron tools became the most potent tools of slave society, especially for agriculture and construction. These could not yet be produced abundantly and thus easily lent themselves to private ownership by a definite class. The private ownership of the means of production was also extended to the ownership of men and women as slaves, as beasts of burden. At first, this was a progressive development from the old barbaric practice of simply killing off serious offenders in society and captives of war. But eventually the ruling class in society made it a systematic and sustained practice to turn more men into slaves until these became a major means of production in society. The Hebrew society that we know from the Old and New Testaments of the Bible was a slave society. So were our sources of ancient classical learning, the Athenian city-state and the Roman Empire. The basic classes in these societies were the slave-owning aristocracy and the slaves. The economic needs of society were in the main produced by the slaves, and the slave-owning aristocracy lorded over society. In slave society, there were also the non-basic or intermediate classes like artisans, free-holding peasants, the plebeians, the merchants, and intelligentsia. Just as the slave society could arise only on the basis of the productive level achieved in a barbaric society, so did the feudal society on the basis of that achieved by slave society. It took some 4,000 known years of slave civilization before feudal societies came into full existence in the Middle Ages in Europe. In China, it took 2,000 known years of slave civilization before the feudal society emerged. Upon the breakup of the Roman Empire, under the onslaughts of revolts by slaves and subjugated nations and peoples, feudal societies emerged in Europe. With land as the principal means of production, the relations of production between slave master and slaves transformed into those between landlord and serf, with the former in control. The slave became the serf. He could no longer be bought or sold like a beast of burden nor be subject to extremely arbitrary laws which easily cost him his life. But he was bound to the piece of land assigned to him and could not leave it unless allowed by his lord. He was obliged to pay rent to his lord. Agriculture and husbandry greatly expanded in feudal society. Metal tools for clearing the forest and tilling the soil became more available. Deep plowing, intercropping, fallowing, more efficient use of draft animals and improved irrigation were adopted. In the early period of feudal society, the serf was given the illusion of owning the piece of land he tilled, especially when he was the one who cleared it. Thus, he was encouraged to put more land to tillage. He paid rent in the form of labor service, by devoting certain days of the week to work on the land of his lord. Subsequently, land ownership slipped away from the serf through various devices. The distinction between land owned by serf and lord was erased and the serf was obliged to pay rent in the form of crop share. In the later period of feudal society, land rent in the form of cash was increasingly adopted as the bourgeoisie increased its role and influence in the relations of production. The growth of agriculture encouraged the distinct growth of the handicrafts, which included the production of agricultural implements, cloth, and the like. Towns emerged as distinct centers of handicraft production and centers of commerce between the products of the town and the village. The handicraft stage of bourgeois development, characterized by the guild as a form of organization, gave way to manufacturing. No longer was a complete product made by a few men in the same small shop, but a large group of men would be devoted to making only a single part of the complete product day in and day out. The relations between the guild master and artisans was replaced by the manufacturer and a mass of workers put in line according to a high degree of a division of labor. The advance of manufacturing, though still based on handicrafts, made the bourgeoisie a wealthy class, influential as the moneybags in the royal court. As early as the 16th century, it was obvious that the needs of the king for funds to carry out wars to consolidate his power coincided with the needs of the bourgeoisie for a secure market. Also, their interests coincided in colonial expeditions. The scientific advance in mechanical physics from the 17th century onwards gave way to technological inventions which promoted manufacturing in an unprecedented manner in the 18th century. The best known of these inventions were the steam power and the spinning jenny. The bourgeoisie found the feudal mode of production too restrictive and wanted to change and control the relations of production. The French Revolution brought the bourgeoisie to power for the first time in history. By the 19th century, the bourgeoisie had already come into full control of the relations of production in several countries in Europe. Either the landlord class had to compromise for gradual dissolution or be destroyed outright by political upheaval. This class could linger on in Europe, unable to resist absorption into the capitalist economy. The advance of science and technology became even more rapid in the 19th century. It gave rise to what is now often called the Industrial Revolution. Large-scale machine production or mass production became the dominant characteristic of the economic system in a number of European countries. The new powerful means of production were owned by the capitalist class, and the mass of industrial workers or proletariat increased in order to build them up. The relations of production were one basically between the capitalist class and the proletariat, and the former was in control of it. The Communist Manifesto in 1848 noted that the material achievements of capitalism outstripped in a very short period those of all previous civilizations by so many times. It also pointed out that a world economy had arisen, with the capitalist countries capable of bombarding all backward countries with the commodities of capitalist production. But the fundamental message of the manifesto was that the capitalist class had also summoned to life its own gravedigger, the proletariat. Capitalist society was increasingly being divided into two great camps, that of capital and labor. For the first time in the history of mankind, an exploited class had arisen with the capability not only of overthrowing the class that dominates it but also of linking up with other exploited classes in a struggle for emancipation in order to build a new socialist society. In presenting the internal laws of motion of capitalism and its course of development, Marx did his greatest work in Das Kapital, which we shall deal with in a later chapter. In the large terms of historical materialism, Marx and Engels pointed out the social character of the means of production, which in the first place is congealed labor, and the private character of appropriation by the capitalist class. Marx uncovered the extraction of surplus value, unpaid value of labor above paid labor or wages, which leads up to the compelling accumulation of the means of production or productive capital in the hands of the capitalist class and the consequent relative crisis of overproduction. As a result of this, the workers are compelled to stand up and struggle for their class interests, at first through trade unions and subsequently through political parties. Just before the end of the 19th century, capitalism grew into monopoly capitalism in certain countries. Increasingly, in the 20th century, it found in the export of capital aside from commodities the solution to the overconcentration of capital. It was Lenin's turn to study and explain this new phenomenon, which he called modern imperialism, the highest and final stage of capitalist development. He said that just as the old form of capitalism led capitalist rivalries to break out into wars, modern imperialism would lead to more bitter rivalries breaking out into larger wars. But these wars, he pointed out, are self-defeating and would lead to social upheavals and revolutionary civil war. He described modern imperialism as the eve of social revolution and called for turning war into revolution. The first inter-imperialist war, World War II, resulted in the victory of the first socialist revolution in the weakest of imperialist countries, Russia. World War II resulted in the victory of socialism in several countries and the rise of national movements against imperialism and colonialism in the colonies and semi-colonies. In turning to modern imperialism, therefore, capitalism has merely temporarily postponed its demise in its home grounds and has made possible not only the worldwide anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist movement but also the rise of socialism. The socialist mode of production, in sharp contrast to the capitalist one, involves primarily the public ownership of the means of production. In the concrete circumstances of countries which have so far become socialist, however, there have been transitory concessions to private ownership of the means of production, especially in the case of the peasants and even some capitalist entrepreneurs. All strategic industries, ill-gotten productive bureaucrat assets, capitalist farms, and sources of raw materials are definitely nationalized at the inception of socialist society. Insofar as there are considerable vestiges of feudalism, it is both politically and economically wise to carry out bourgeois democratic land reform. This means the free distribution of land to the peasants. Over a period of time, their individual ownership would be raised to the level of cooperative or collective ownership. The process of dissolving private ownership of land among the peasants is smoothed by education, the introduction of farm machines and other modern means, the development of localized industries and the increased capacity of the national industries to absorb those that may be displaced from the farms. However, in collective farms, small private plots are allotted to peasants for gardening to serve home use, private taste, and some amount of localized exchange. Concessions to some private capitalist entrepreneurs and even private traders are usually more short-lived than those extended to peasants. These concessions are extended on varying considerations, depending on the concrete conditions. At any rate, the most important economic reason is that entrepreneurial and professional skills and widespread small trading facilities continue to be useful. After all, the commanding heights of the economy are already socialist. It is only a foolish leadership that encourages the expatriation of people, especially when these have skills to contribute. Communist society is still too far away for any dialectical and historical materialist to be able to work out its details. It is enough to know the basic principles and outline of the communist future. Although some writings of Marx and Engels state that socialism is the first stage of communism, Lenin, favored by further proletarian revolutionary experience, said that socialism would take an entire historical epoch. At any rate, we can say that the socio-economic, political, and cultural achievements of socialism prepares the way for the communist society. In socialist society, private profit ceases basically and then completely. But social profit takes its place. In the critique of the Gotha program, Marx thoroughly debunked the idea of the equal distribution of the fruits of labor as too simple-minded and nonsense. In the socialist mode of production, the income above wages will be allotted in the following manner: 1. The expansion of productive capacity, not just simple reproduction of capital or simple replacement of depreciation. 2. Increased fund for public welfare, public housing, public transport, nurseries, hospitals, schools, theaters, libraries, parks, recreation facilities, etc. 3. Administration, and 4. Defense. Private profit that under current circumstances is frozen in unproductive assets or wasted on luxurious, conspicuous spending by a few shall cease to exist. So shall unnecessary and bloated costs of administration, like excessive salaries, allowances, and bonuses for the bosses, and the unnecessary costs of private economic competition and bankruptcies. The possibility of the communist society lies in the awesome capacity of the modern means of mass production, hastened by the cumulative progress of science and technology and unfettered by the motive of private profit, in the steady increase of the real wages or the purchasing power of the workers, and in the rapid expansion of public welfare facilities. The work time can even be reduced to allow people to engage in more cultural and other worthwhile activities and thus become well integrated. Thus, work itself ceases to be a drudgery and becomes a joy. The high-tech productive capacity of the imperialist-dominated world today is enough to wipe out poverty. But the wealth created by the people is taken away from them through the exploitative relations of production obtaining. Myths of scarcity and limits to growth are also spread, and the environment is ravaged for the purpose of private profit. If the United States of America were to turn socialist today, it will not only permanently eliminate its problem of unemployment and poverty for a considerable portion of its population, 20%, but will facilitate and accelerate the growth of other countries by several folds. Anyhow, high technology accelerates the crisis of overproduction in the world capitalist system and creates at a faster rate the conditions for the people's resistance to imperialism and neocolonialism and for the irrepressible advance of socialism through the twists and turns of history. The capitalist relations of production are becoming more and more incapable of containing the growth of the forces of production. B. The superstructure of society. The superstructure of society consists of the ideas, institutions, and fields of activity above the mode of production. Philosophy, the arts and sciences, politics, economic theory, jurisprudence, religion, morality, and the like belong to the superstructure. The institutions, personnel, and activities in the superstructure are maintained by the surplus generated by the mode of production. The superstructure is founded on the mode of production. The former reflects the latter. In general, the material base of society determines superstructure. Thus, the level of cultural development and the dominant currents of thought in a society are expressive of the basic mode of production. While it may be said that the mode of production is primary to the superstructure, Marxism goes further to state that they interact. At certain times, the superstructure can restrict the growth of the mode of production. And at other times, the former can hasten the latter. Just as reactionary ideas can linger on in the superstructure, progressive ideas can arise in it ahead of the actual transformation of the mode of production. The contradictions in the mode of production are reflected in contradictions in the superstructure, and the latter influence the former. Marxism encompasses the complexity and dialectical relations of the mode of production and superstructure. It shuns economic determinism, the one-sided dictation of the economic system on the superstructure. Of all institutions and organizations in the superstructure of a class society, the state is the highest form. It is the most powerful and most comprehensive. It claims the obedience of all inhabitants within its territory, and it has the means to enforce that obedience. Defenders of the bourgeois state present it as a superclass instrument for the general good and often quibble about the forms of government in order to obscure the class character of the state. Thus, the Athenian slave state is simplistically referred to as the cradle of democracy simply because at certain periods the General Assembly or Representative Assembly of slave-owning aristocrats and freemen held sway instead of an autocracy or oligarchy at the helm of government. Completely obscured is the essential fact that this so-called democracy was the rule of the slave-owning class over a great mass of slaves and other people. In this regard, an ecclesiastical chapter in the Middle Ages might as well be called a democracy. Along this line, many bourgeois historians actually call the Magna Carta of the 13th century a milestone of democracy. In this document, the feudal monarch of England pledged himself to consulting with the feudal barons before imposing new taxes. To the Marxists, the most important consideration in characterizing a state is what class rules. To them the state is the special instrument of class coercion over another class in order to realize a certain kind of society. It is the institution in the superstructure which preserves the relations of production in the material base of society. It consists essentially of the army, police, the courts and the prisons, the very same apparatuses that the bourgeois political theorist would point to as the guarantee to law and order for the common good. The state arose with exploitative class society. In the long period of primitive communal society, there was merely the authority of the clan, tribal leader, or council of elders. The community was so small that the leaders or elders were close to their followers and together they could easily make decisions whenever they wanted to. Contrary to the idyllic presentation of primitive society, the leader could at times be abusive. But certainly he was not yet the representative of any ruling exploitative class. All menfolk were warriors in the interest of the community, and normally there was no special body of men performing military duties full-time. There were simply no means of production yet which could be monopolized by any class. There was simply no surplus product to take away. The whole community had to struggle together for bare subsistence. Considering the extremely low level of its mode of production, the primitive communal society had a very crude kind of superstructure. Apart from their practical thoughts related to production, the primitive people had superstitious beliefs ranging from animism and magic through ancestor worship to polytheism, and made uncomplicated rhythmic melodies and flat, childlike drawings. They were not literate. The society could not generate the surplus product to support special bodies devoted to various fields of activity besides the simplest division of labor in economic production. As we go further to discuss the superstructure of the various forms of society, take note that we seem to set one form of society from another absolutely. This is so because our main interest now is to present the basic characteristics of each type of superstructure. When we deal with social transformation, we shall give due attention to the fact that the embryo of a later form of society is necessarily found in a preceding form of society. This is true with regard to both mode of production and superstructure. The slave-owning class built the state for the first time in civilization. Whether there was tyranny, autocracy, or a representative assembly of slave owners at its helm, the slave state maintained the relations of production whereby the slave masters dominated the slaves. This was true from the most ancient Oriental civilizations down to the Roman Empire. As a coercive instrument of class rule, the slave state saw to it that the exploited class of slaves was constantly replenished by people who could not pay their debts, violated laws against property and persons, or were captured from other communities. The slave state also went into empire building for the purpose of getting slaves, booty, and tribute. These empires ranged from the small one, wherein one city-state dominated a few others, to the vast one of the Romans. With society already capable of creating surplus product, distinct institutions and activities in the superstructure developed. Such groups of individuals as politicians, scribes, administrative officers, priests, philosophers, master builders, poets, painters, sculptors, other artists, and professionals arose mainly in the service of the ruling system. For brevity, Let us cite only the most outstanding achievements of slave society with great influence in the Western tradition. The Hebrews put forward through the Old and New Testaments most vigorously the concept of monotheistic religion, an advance on highly irrational polytheism and emperor worship. The Greeks gave natural philosophy, great works of poetry, especially the epic and drama, and excellent architecture. The Romans merely elaborated on the cultural achievements of the Greeks but raised to a new and higher level the art of administration and jurisprudence. The feudal societies that emerged from the collapse and fragmentation of the Roman Empire had, of course, the feudal state as the main feature of their superstructure. As the emancipated peoples and slaves settled down and developed a feudal mode of production, the feudal state arose to maintain the relations of production whereby a hierarchy of landed aristocrats lorded over the masses of serfs and other people. A striking feature of the superstructure was the ideological monopoly enjoyed by the Catholic Church. During the overthrow of the Roman Empire, Christianity had managed to be on both sides of the conflict. It was the state religion of the empire since the 4th century, and Christian missionaries were deployed among the subjugated nations and peoples. Bereft of any ideology or culture higher than that of their adversary, the subjugated peoples adopted Christianity. Thus, Christendom prevailed in Europe. The Catholic clergy cultivated the union of church and state and likewise the idea that God is the source of authority. They advised the feudal rulers and instructed the children of the royalty and nobility. The ecclesiastical organization was even more extensive than the administrative system of the state. The parish was based on the village and the priests were in ways depended on for certain functions of government, especially tax collection. In cooperation with the church, the secular rulers had to contend not only with the clergy within society but also the papacy seated in Rome. Except for certain periods of extreme corruption, debauchery, and loss of authority, the papacy was the effective international power arching over the feudal societies. The empire of Charlemagne was a flash in the pan. The Holy Roman Empire existed from the 10th century to its end in the 16th century. It was a farcical copy of the original Roman Empire in the long run, but it nurtured the European feudal states under the canopy of Christendom. In the first half of the Christian millennium, from the 5th to the 10th centuries, the Church concentrated on catechism. The highest level of education was available only to monks, and it consisted mainly of the study of the Bible. Except for what served the Christian ideology, the philosophical, proto-scientific and literary works of Greece and Rome were suppressed. As Engels would say, natural philosophy was subordinated to theology. What was most cherished in philosophy was metaphysics. To be precise, only the Augustinian adaptation of Neoplatonism, Plotinus, was propagated until the late 13th century. Thomas Aquinas made an adaptation of Aristotelianism on the basis of secondary materials, the commentaries of the Islamic scholar Averroes. No university existed in Christendom until the University of Paris was established in the 11th century. But the main fare was still theological and metaphysical. More advanced secular learning and ancient classical learning were available either in the schools of Islamic Spain, Norman Sicily, or scholarly circles in Constantinople. The Roman Catholic monopoly of the superstructure in all societies of Western Europe was eventually undermined by the increasing virulence of the conflict between state and secular interests, the Italian Renaissance which promoted secular humanist literature emulating pagan works of the past, the Reformation and rise of Protestant movements, the rise of scientific investigation and, of course, the rise of the manufacturing and commercial bourgeoisie. To the extent that the capitalist mode of production took hold of certain parts of Europe, the germinal bourgeoisie were conceded political rights by the feudal authorities. This occurred in divided Italy where cities which economically benefited most from the religious crusades and Mediterranean trade became republican communes and were responsible for their own economy and defense, as early as the 13th century. But it was first during the Civil War in England in the 17th century that a flourishing bourgeoisie made a powerful bid to acquire its own political power in a major European country. The French Revolution was eventually the culmination of the long-drawn efforts of the bourgeoisie to gain state power for itself. Against an extremely resistant nobility and clergy, the bourgeoisie together with the other classes of French society went on to overthrow feudal power. Revolutionizing the feudal superstructure, the bourgeoisie promoted subjective idealism, empiricism in England and rationalism in the continent, the idea of rational, secular, and scientific enlightenment and progress, liberal democracy, under such slogans as liberty, equality, and fraternity, and the separation of church and state, and the economic theory of free competition, an advance on mercantilism, whereby the feudal monarch and the national bourgeoisie worked hand in hand through state trading monopolies and concessions to the bourgeoisie. The West European bourgeoisie took advantage of the workers' armed uprising in 1848 to trounce feudal power on a wide scale and at the same time suppress the working class and carry on the Industrial Revolution further. After getting hold of state power, the bourgeoisie used it to control the working class and suppress any resistance to capitalist exploitation. Compromising with a landed aristocracy on the wane, the bourgeoisie reverted to old ideas and recanted on its blasphemies against church and religion. Of course, it continued to avail of science and technology in pushing the growth of productive forces. But even in this regard, the advance of science and technology has been subordinated to and restricted by the process of maximizing profit. Productive forces have been destroyed repeatedly via the economic crises and wars, not to speak of the wasteful consumption in boom times which induced every consequent crisis. In the imperialist era of capitalism, in the midst of which we are, individual freedom and free enterprise are still the catchwords of the capitalist class in its prevailing theories and propaganda. But the fact is that whole masses of individuals, the proletariat and other exploited classes, are being oppressed and exploited by capitalist states and their client states. It is monopoly capitalism and not free enterprise that actually rides roughshod over the people in the capitalist world. In comparison to the superstructure of feudalism, that of capitalism is definitely more advanced. Under feudalism at its best, education was available only to the children of the nobility and the bourgeoisie in schools run by clerics. Under capitalism, there is universal public education in the elementary grades or even up to high school and also state universities, and there are all sorts of non-sectarian private schools at every level. The media of information and education have also vastly expanded through the advance of science and technology. The needs of the capitalist mode of production are met by the superstructure, in terms of training more men and women in the various professions. This is not only to enhance production for profit directly or indirectly but also to throttle or mislead the exploited classes. While the upper classes of society in the capitalist world have a cosmopolitan character, the kind of pop culture dished out to the masses consists of trivial works that promote the individualistic values on money grubbing, sex and violence. This totalitarianism of the capitalist class over the exploited masses in the field of culture is touted as the hallmark of freedom. It is counterposed to the revolutionary ideological and political unity of the exploited masses. The inhabitants of the economically advanced capitalist society today can boast of a lifestyle and flashy possessions far above the income level of the workers and peasants and even the lower and middle classes in the colonies and semi-colonies. But it should be noted that the ability of those workers to get creature comforts, often on mortgage, rests on the imperialist exploitation of other nations, while the crisis of overproduction and capital overaccumulation does not yet result in economic stagnation and massive unemployment even in capitalist countries. An unprecedentedly grave economic crisis is now occurring in the capitalist mode of production. This is reflected in a growing crisis in its culture. There is huge waste of resources and serious threats to mankind in the rivalry and arms race between an imperialist and social imperialist power, cutthroat competition among the capitalist countries, the demands of the third world countries and people for emancipation and development. All these are putting every capitalist country in dire straits. Socialist society has arisen only a few decades ago, in 1917. But it has chalked up material productive achievements that took the bourgeoisie several centuries to make. On the basis of this, a socialist superstructure is flourishing. Even in the Soviet Union, which has retrogressed into state monopoly capitalism, it cannot be denied that what it previously achieved through socialism is so great as to enable it to continue confronting the United States in the Cold War. Socialist societies have so far arisen in countries with a backlog of feudalism. Thus the socialist states have taken the form of people's democracy, with the alliance of workers and peasants as the main political base. At the same time, proletarian dictatorship is exercised to disempower the exploiting classes. It is proletarian, Marxist ideology, politics and organization that prevail, even as bourgeois democratic reforms like land reform have to be undertaken for a while in a period of transition. The Communist Party is the chief propagator and applicator of Marxism in a socialist society, and it is preeminent in the socialist state because it has been the leader in the transformation of the old society and in the continuing proletarian revolution. Thus, in China until today, various non-communist parties and associations continue to exist and are represented in the People's Consultative Council and the National People's Congress. All the freedoms formally guaranteed in a liberal democratic constitution are carried over into a socialist constitution, with the crucial difference that the proletarian dictatorship and the basic alliance of the working class and peasantry are upheld, and the bourgeoisie and the landlord class are deprived of the freedom to exploit and oppress the people under the guise of individual freedom and the right to own property, including the means of production. While the people achieve real freedom, only a comparatively small number, a handful, of exploiters and counter-revolutionaries lose or have their freedom restricted according to their political or criminal culpability. Unlike the bourgeois state, the socialist state frankly admits that it is a class dictatorship against its class enemies, even as it is the democratic instrument of the people. Freedom of thought and belief is respected in socialist countries. Marxism maintains the scientific and optimistic view that correct ideas emerge through debate and democratic persuasion and through social practice where the ideas are tested and verified. Within the Communist Party, no line or policy is adopted without democratic discussion. In society at large, the freedom to espouse any idea or belief is wider, short of any overt act of violence against the socialist state and counter-revolutionary effort to restore the exploiting classes to power. The materialist scientific outlook of Marxism is conducive to the rapid advance of science and technology, not for the sake of private profit but of social profit. What happens in the first place in the socialist transformation of the means of production is the removal of fetters imposed on them by the selfish and narrow interests of the exploiting classes. Thus, we are witness today to a China, extremely backward only 3 decades ago, fast approaching the most advanced standards of science and technology for agriculture, industry, and defense. The quality of life of the large masses of workers and peasants improves in accordance with the expansion of socialist production. Education at any level is open to the workers and peasants and their children without any cost. The new heroes of the culture are revolutionary workers, peasants, soldiers, and intellectuals. New values run through the works of arts and letters. At the same time, learning from the past and from abroad is encouraged to serve the present needs of the socialist society. Socialism as a form of society is still relatively new, but its achievements in both material base and superstructure are already gigantic. It will take an entire historical epoch before it passes on to communism. We can also say that socialism will outlive its purposes, the historic mission of the proletariat, at an accelerated rate when modern imperialism shall have been defeated. The withering of the state is pointed to by Marxists as the most decisive characteristic of the transition of socialism to communism. So long as imperialism exists and so long as there is still an internal danger of capitalist restoration, socialist societies cannot be expected to let down their guard and dissolve the instruments of coercion by which the proletariat can keep down and eliminate the bourgeoisie as a class. Those who are capable of thinking only in terms of pre-socialist state power cannot imagine how the state could ever be dissolved. They call this impossible and utopian. What compounds their ignorance of the Marxist definition of the state as a class instrument of coercion is that they think unfairly that Marxism prescribes the end of all authority in communism. That is not Marxism but anarchism. We can say in the most general manner that some authority will still exist in communist society. But it will certainly not be an authority with coercive apparatuses for the private gain of any exploitative class or group. Even at its early stage, socialism has already demonstrated that there can be a kind of state which still uses the coercive apparatuses against its enemies, but which has put an end to productive and social relations whereby a few belonging to a narrow class can exploit masses of people belonging to another class. Given more time, socialist society can generalize the level of living and education of the present upper middle class. If such were the condition of the people in the whole society, is there any need for the instruments of class coercion? Crimes against property because of economic want will go down to zero. Most crimes and legal cases today relate to property and poverty. The long period of socialism will create not only the economic conditions but also those social, political, and cultural relations that will make a classless society, communism, possible. See social transformation, revolution. A society is ripe for a radical transformation when the forces of production have grown to the point that they can no longer be contained by the relations of production obtaining. In a manner of speaking, the integuments of society are burst asunder. The socio-economic crisis leads to a political crisis in which the ruling class is unable to rule in the old way, the people are desirous of revolutionary change and there is a revolutionary party strong enough to lead the revolution. Under these conditions, the struggle between the ruling class and the ruled class intensifies. The ruling class tries to preserve the outmoded relations of production and mollify or suppress the ruled class. The latter is determined to overthrow the ruling class and seeks to change the old relations of production. The class struggle rises from the mode of production to the superstructure and the whole of society. The ruling class tries to make use of the superstructure, especially the state, in order to preserve the outmoded relations of production. Likewise, the ruled class tries to make use of anything it can in the superstructure and hasten to create the political and cultural means in its favor. Thus, the superstructure becomes a field of class struggle. In the course of class struggle, reforms or revolution may occur. Under certain circumstances, the relations of production may still be adjusted and concessions granted to the ruled class. Or the ruling class may simply refuse to make reforms, even when still possible, and thus provoke a revolutionary upheaval that takes the form of armed revolution by the ruled class. Conditions may also reach such a point that mere reforms would no longer suffice to preserve the relations of production. The ultimate weapon of any ruling class in order to retain its class rule is the state as an instrument of coercion. It is openly used to repress the ruled class when all assuasive means such as the parliament and other civil institutions fail to appease the ruled class. In the face of flagrant armed repression by the state, the ruled class is induced to resist and organize its own revolutionary party and armed force. If the ruled class does not fight, it continues to be dominated by an outmoded relations of production and by the state power of the exploiting class. But the tendency of the ruled class to struggle for its own rights and interests will still be there. If the ruled class chooses to fight and organizes an armed force, it is determined to change the relations of production and establish a completely new society. The outbreak of an armed revolution depends on the objective conditions in the mode of production and how the two sides in the class struggle consciously maneuver in the use of the superstructure. It is also possible for the leadership of the exploited class to be co-opted or defeated by the ruling class for some time so that the coup-ting or winning class, the ruling class, can arrange the relations of production either by way of further reaction or a series of reforms to reinforce reaction. Reformism rejects the theory and practice of social revolution, especially that which entails the armed overthrow of the reactionary state. It is a system of thought that insists on pursuing an indefinite series of reforms to improve the incumbent exploitative and oppressive class society. History has shown that, independent of the wishes of the reformists, the political crisis in a capitalist society can lead to the inciting moment that triggers the acceleration and climax of the revolutionary process of seizing political power. It has also shown that in an underdeveloped and semi-feudal society, with a large peasant population, The chronic socio-economic and political crisis provides the basis for a protracted people's war of encircling the cities from the countryside. In Marxism, the armed seizure of political power by an oppressed and exploited class is the central task of revolution and is the necessary prelude to all-round social revolution. Without political power in its hands, the proletariat cannot make the social revolution. This social revolution involves essentially the total transformation of the relations of production. It also involves a prolonged process of totally transforming the superstructure, making it correspond to and thereby enhance the relations of production. The historic revolutionary mission of the proletariat is not limited to an armed seizure of power. It extends over a long period of struggle from the change of political power to the period of socialist revolution and construction until the dawn of communism. It is bourgeois or feudal confusion of mind or misinterpretation of Marxism to narrow down social revolution to a mere spasm of violence. The Marxist understanding of revolutionary violence as the people's sovereign right against oppression is no different from that of the liberal democrat. Such right is always implicitly or explicitly upheld in liberal democratic constitutions. The only difference lies in the goals. The Marxist wants socialism and the liberal democrat wants capitalism. Social revolution is a conscious mass undertaking. Marxism rejects a number of false theories in this regard. Among them are the theory of mechanical inevitability, the theory of spontaneous masses and the theory that great individuals rather than the masses make history. The theory of mechanical inevitability puts the ruled class in the passive position of not consciously doing anything to change the relations of production because it is the growth of the productive forces that will inevitably change the relations of production. What is obscured by this theory of mechanical inevitability is the fact that the ruling class has a prior conscious control not only of the relations of production but also of the superstructure. It can one-sidedly prolong the relations of production if the exploited class does not make effective resistance. This explains why as late as the 16th century onwards master-slave relations in the Americas could exist side by side with lord-serf relations as well as with capital-labor relations. Until now, there are still remnants of primitive communal, slave and feudal societies in the most backward parts of the world. In many colonies and semi-colonies, feudalism and semi-feudalism persist on a large scale. The theory of spontaneous masses posits that the ruled class without any conscious leadership and without a definite ideology, program, and organized strength can transform society into a new one. This is an anarchist notion. It again obscures the prior ruling class control of the relations of production and the superstructure. To say the least, the unorganized masses are eventually rendered helpless before the highly conscious and highly organized ruling class, which is in command of a large number of armed personnel that can prevail over spontaneous mass uprisings. The direct opposite of the theory of spontaneous masses is the theory that great individuals rather than the masses make history. The Marxist view is that the people are the motive force and makers of history and that great men as leaders are at best representatives of great mass movements. The brilliance of leaders can help hasten the advance of a movement, or the loss of such leaders can delay such an advance. But so long as a conscious, well-organized mass movement exists, a structure of leadership can replace a leader as soon as he falls or is lost. Marxism requires both correct leadership and mass participation in the making of revolution. When they speak of the people as the motive force and makers of history, Marxists mean a single leading class and the other exploited and oppressed classes rising against the ruling class. The leading class must be able to rally under its leadership other classes and strata against the ruling class. Broad organizations and groups of various interests are aroused and mobilized against the ruling class. And the Revolutionary Army enlists fighters from the broad ranks of the people. To serve as the vanguard of the revolution, the leading class has a political party with a progressive ideology, political program, and a solid organization of cadres and conscious and conscientious members. In the face of a ruling class like the bourgeoisie, which is highly conscious of its class interests and has a complex array of highly developed means either for crushing or misleading any attempt at radical social transformation, the proletariat as the leading class has to comprehend the proper relationship of people, class, party, and cadres or leaders. Let us now review social transformation as it has occurred in the history of mankind. In primitive times, the Paleolithic clan commune lagged for a painfully long period. In this regard, we can easily observe the primary role that the forces of production, particularly the means of production at this stage of human existence, played in the development of society. The Neolithic society of the extended clan or tribe could arise only on the basis of the refinement and improvement of stone tools. This took another painfully long period. The crudity and puniness of the forces of production and the reflective flimsiness of the superstructure have prolonged the process of social transformation. A long period of social evolution had to take place before there could be social revolution. Man had to struggle hard from being a blind part of nature to becoming one increasingly distinguishable from it through the growth of the forces of production. The transition from primitive communal society to slave society was made possible on the basis of achievement in the former. In the womb of Neolithic barbaric society, man started husbandry, agriculture, the use of hard metals and the conversion of social offenders and war captives into slaves. These were the forces of production which increasingly wore out the simple division of labor during the late period of those barbaric societies that managed to graduate into the slave form of society. The slave society firmed up and expanded the conversion of men and women into a class of slaves from the ranks of social offenders and war captives in order to produce the surplus product for the benefit of a slave-owning class and its civil retinue of priests, scribes, administrative officers, and the like, and its army and other coercive apparatuses. For the first time in the history of mankind, classes arose and the state was established to maintain the political and economic power of the ruling class. The drive to increase the surplus product impelled nation building and empire building for expanding the ranks of slaves from war captives. The majority of slaves were mainly deployed in the fields to till the land for the benefit of the aristocrats and freemen. Agriculture was expanded. Upon the tremendous increase of slaves, the master-slave relations of production started to become outmoded. Oppression and exploitation increased even as it became more difficult to manage so many slaves on the wide fields. The slaves started to rebel. So did the subjugated nations and peoples in the empire as they were obliged to create more surplus product for the military governor and the imperial coffers. The class struggle between the slave-owning aristocracy and the masses of slaves intensified. As the magnates of slavery tended to accumulate slaves and land, vast numbers of landed freemen who owned a few slaves and even lower sections of the slave aristocracy were bankrupted. The Roman Empire reached its peak in the 1st and 2nd centuries, but in the 3rd century it began a protracted period of decline. The weakening and fragmentation of the empire eventually resulted in the emancipation of slaves. Either upon the victory of the revolts of slaves and subject nations or upon the adaptation of original slave owners to the feudal relations of production, large masses of slaves became converted to the status of serfs. It should be observed that in the transformation of a slave society into a feudal one, the largest exploited class did not become a ruling class. But it made substantial gains. It was no longer prey to customs or laws that easily cost the lives of its members. At the early stage of feudal society, the serfs were also often given the illusion of owning their own parcels of land, provided they worked on the lands of the landlords on certain days. This served to stimulate the clearing of land and expansion of agriculture. In the feudal mode of production, land is the principal means of production and the serfs were in the main the people in production. These forces of production were subject to the relations of production dominated by the landlord class or feudal aristocracy. The tithe-collecting Roman Catholic Church was also part of the landlord class. The Pope was landlord of the so-called Papal States, and the monastic orders and parishes owned land in the European states and colonies. In many European countries, the Church corporately became the biggest landlord. Though several feudal states sprung from the ruins of the Roman Empire, they were dominated by a single interstate ideology and institution, that of Christianity. The Church and the state were the powerful forces in the superstructure of European feudal society. They united to defend the system against common foes, but they also had conflicts of interests. At the peak of feudal development, Serious peasant rebel movements were already cropping up and often took the form of heretical movements. The religious crusades at first tended to absorb peasant unrest and unify the monarchies in Europe under Christianity. But in the 13th century, both the church and state took violent measures such as massacres to suppress the serfs who combined anti-feudal resistance and religious heresy. The papacy merely manipulated the various feudal states to get what it wanted and sometimes got the short end of a conflict with a more clever secular ruler. But by the 16th century, the papacy had its own army to assert its power in the papal states and punish rebellious peasants. Against the rise of the secular humanist spirit and the outbreak of peasant rebellions in the 16th and 17th century, the Church in cooperation with the state expanded the work of the Inquisition from suppressing heretics to wide-scale witch hunt. The Church also repeatedly instigated religious wars against Protestants. In Western Europe, after the so-called barbarians had settled down, no peasant movement succeeded in seizing political power from any landlord class dominating feudal society. In China, some peasant movements succeeded in taking over political power over entire feudal states but could not go beyond the feudal form of society. Their leaderships merely took over the role of the deposed landlords. As in China, the peasantry of Europe was not pushing forward any new mode of production even if they were moved by clear specific grievances. They only had vague ideas of what constituted more just relations of production than what existed. They were often provoked to revolt by excessive rent, taxes, and other levies. They could not propose any progressive ideology, except some alternative notions of Christianity considered heretical by the dominant church. Within feudal society, however, a new class pushing a new mode of production and a new outlook grew. At first, a mercantile bourgeoisie arose with the towns and cities which served as centers of handicraft production and trade between town and country or between far-flung areas. Subsequently, a manufacturing bourgeoisie arose from the ranks of the mercantile bourgeoisie. When the manufacturing bourgeoisie developed further into an industrial bourgeoisie, especially in the later part of the 18th century, the bourgeoisie was in a position to make a frontal challenge to the old feudal aristocracy for political supremacy. In previous times, the bourgeoisie had tactfully cooperated with the feudal monarchs in the consolidation of national markets and in the financing of colonial expeditions and wars. Beside the growth of the capitalist mode of production, which had extended to capitalist farming, there had been a long period of ideological preparation for the political ascendancy of the bourgeoisie. This ranged from such development as the Italian Renaissance in the 15th century through the scientific inquiries into physics in the 17th century to the French Enlightenment in the 18th century. Unlike the peasantry, the bourgeoisie stood for a new mode of production that was capable of replacing the old feudal mode, and it easily adopted a progressive scientific outlook that effectively destroyed the ideological monopoly of the church. In the French Revolution, the bourgeoisie took the vanguard position and allied itself with the peasants, workers, and other sections of the population to overthrow the state power of the landlord class and the authority of the Catholic Church. The political supremacy of the industrial bourgeoisie over society was established. In capitalist society, the new class struggle is between the capitalist class and the working class. The growth of large-scale machine production and the proletariat has reached the point that the capitalist relations of production hinder rather than enhance them. The capitalist relations of production and the capitalist class can be removed and the proletariat can establish the socialist relations of production. Unlike the peasantry, the proletariat stands for a new mode of production. As a matter of fact, the peasantry is dissolved by the expanding mode of capitalist production and has no place to go but join the ranks of the proletariat. Thus, the Communist Manifesto speaks of a society increasingly divided into two great camps, that of capital and that of labor. For the first time in the history of mankind, an exploited class which does not previously own the means of production is in the position of becoming the ruling class in a completely new form of society. It stands for a mode of production that continues to forge ahead long after the seizure of political power. Also, for the first time, an exploited class cannot emancipate itself without emancipating all other exploited classes. As never before in the history of mankind, the freedom of the entire people can be achieved. The development of the working class has undergone 3 stages. The first one was the machine-smashing stage, when workers displaced by machines anarchically destroyed or sabotaged machines in vengeance. The second one was the trade union stage, when the workers learned to organize themselves for the first time to fight for their own economic interests. The third one was the stage when the workers started to form their political parties to wage political struggles in their own class interests and in alliance with other oppressed classes in society. In 1848, Marx and Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto as a programmatic guide for the workers of all countries. Without even having read this manifesto, significant numbers of workers participated in uprisings in several cities of Europe in 1848. These were quelled and bourgeois reaction reigned. Marx and Engels further laid the ideological foundation of the working class movement and participated in the work of the International Workingmen's Association, First International. In 1871, the proletariat of Paris seized political power and it survived for a little over 2 months. This is a milestone in the history of Marxism, as it proved the thesis of Marx that the proletariat as a class is capable of organizing itself in order to seize political power and hold it. Marx hailed the achievements of the Paris Commune, criticized its errors and drew the lessons for the future advance of the working class. In an attempt to resolve the contradiction or class struggle in capitalist society, the capitalist class in the various capitalist countries engaged in modern imperialism. The result was that alliances and counter-alliances of capitalist countries resulted in graver crises of overproduction and world wars. World War I led to the victory of socialism in one country. World War II led to the victory of socialism in several countries and the vigorous growth of national independence movements. To the extent that there were still vestiges of feudalism in countries that turned socialist, bourgeois democratic reforms like land reform and concessions to national entrepreneurs were undertaken. What makes the capitalist society radically different from all social formations is that it has internationalized its system of oppression and exploitation through modern imperialism, to the point that in many countries today working class parties have arisen to fight it and its reactionary puppets.